Hi, welcome to XRTV-Victoria. I'm Mark Nykanen. We gratefully acknowledge that we live and work as guests on the unceded, unsurrendered lands of the Wasanich, Lekwungen, and Willamette peoples. For 6 months, Indigenous and settler activists have blocked logging roads into the pristine Fairy Creek watershed near Port Renfrew, British Columbia. In this episode, we're going to take a behind-the-scenes look at what those determined forest defenders have been doing and what their plans are now that winter is upon them.
This is the 59th second of the 59th minute of the 11th hour of old growth forests in BC.
Old growth is special, it's important, it's rare, and it's threatened. That's why we should care.
People actually believe they stopped old growth logging in the late 1990s. No, it's being wiped out right now. I don't call the industry now a forestry industry. It's a timber extraction operation.
You know, one way or another, old growth logging is going to end. And it's either going to be because there's no more old growth left in a good 5-10 years, or because we actually end it and have something left. If we want to save any of our ancient rainforest, it's now or never.
It was the height of summer. Blockaders at Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island blocked industry access to an old-growth forest, which is on unceded Pacheedaht territory. Scores of trees had already been cut, making way for massive road-building equipment. Momentum was on the side of the Teal Jones Group, the largest privately held forest products company on Canada's west coast, which held the rights to the old growth. These trees survive because they can defy nature's greatest challenges for centuries. But when Teal Jones took aim at Fairy Creek's complex ecosystem, these ancient giants, guardians of rivers, creeks, soil, and sky, needed help themselves. They got it. Blockaders, young and old, indigenous and settler, came to protect the trees, going up against time, money, and the maneuvering of industrial logging on a huge scale. It was David versus Goliath in the old growth. For the forest defenders, the goal was scary but simple. Stop the road building, the trees stand. Fail, they fall. A time-lapse map shows how the Fairy Creek tributary was increasingly crowded by clear-cuts. This is the view at ground level. The devastation seems to go on and on, because it does. About 2/3 of the watershed is protected from logging, but those restrictions are far from ironclad. The logging road was headed to the completely unprotected trees. The blockaders stopped the road when it was just shy of the old growth high on Fairy Creek's ridge.
We got there just in time. Like the road was sitting on the ridge, and you see the flagging, and it descends right down. And you can see they've pre-flagged all their cut blocks. And so you can see all the areas that are planned to be logged in that upper watershed that run down these really steep slopes to the headwaters of Fairy Creek. And that type of clear-cut logging would have devastating effects on the whole watershed.
How did it feel to realize that you got there in the nick of time?
Yeah, that was very powerful to realize that.
Blockaders had seized the logging road. Now they had to keep it. Night and day, the forest defenders remained on guard. Other activists produced powerful videos about the beauty of old growth and its ugly destruction. These videos have been viewed about 20,000 times. Fairy Creek's Facebook and Instagram posts have reached millions more. Will was a prominent spokesperson in the early days of the blockade.
If you want to see real change, you got to stand up for it.
But the blockaders couldn't stand alone indefinitely. A call went out, rallies were held, This one in Nanaimo in early
Logging
August.
around there, we've lost this coverage that has been building from time immemorial. So over these eons, animals die, trees die, insects die, arthropods, everything, and it gets layered and compacted.
Videographer Ken Dawson shows us what Carol Tootle means.
So you can see here, see how these trees held the earth together? And you see how now it's all falling apart. And you see this thin layer of soil here at the top. It took eons for that layer of soil to be deposited on this mountainside, and then for life to take hold, and then for thousands of years for trees to grow. And these roads are creating erosion that then goes downhill, down to this beautiful creek here. And this creek, like so many, go towards where humans are. This one, in this case, goes to Port Renfrew, where Fairy Lake is. And beautiful Fairy Lake. It's a resort that people use all summer long and enjoy for their vacations. Well, and this is also a stream that fish are in. And this sediment comes down and it builds up in these streams, and it blocks and poisons and just devastates. So it isn't just simply the disrespect for the ancient trees here, but it's the disrespect for nature altogether. The clear-cutting practice has just got to stop. It's just devastating.
Pacheedaht hereditary elder Bill Jones has supported the blockade. At the August rally, he recalled a line from O Canada.
And they sang, "We stand on guard for thee." And I think us people who are caring for our great mother are likely the only ones that truly understand what standing on guard for thee. But that also involves action. We have to go up there and say, hey, we don't like this road being built here. We know the systematics of the forest destruction by logging roads. And so
Bill Jones, this blockade wouldn't be around right now without Bill Jones, 100%. And not just because we wouldn't be there without his permission. He is really the life force behind the blockade. He's a very wise man.
The Pacheedaht Chief and Council have not taken a position on the blockade. The Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, however, has offered strong support for the action. Both Indigenous and settlers pitched in to expand the blockade and turned the camp into a community. They built a heated shower, woodshed, kitchen, and outhouses. A bus serves as a bunkhouse. The blockaders on Vancouver Island were helped immensely by Joshua Wright, who maintained near constant vigilance more than 100 miles away in Olympia, Washington.
So right now we're looking at the upper Walbrand, which is one of the areas we've had our eye on for a while.
Joshua is just 17 years old and a documentary filmmaker. Here's a clip from his Eden's Last Chance, which is well into production.
In the near future, right now we have it.
When you think of Iraq, is the first thing you think of cedar forest so thick that sunlight never reaches the ground? That's what it was prior to the beginnings of this culture. The first written myth and the second religious text of Western society is Gilgamesh deforesting the hills and valleys of Iraq. So they say that one sign of intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns. You know, let's lay out this pattern and see if we can recognize it in less than 6,000 years.
I think that the choice is between revolution and annihilation at this point.
Joshua's activism at his computer made him invaluable to the forest defenders.
So what I've been doing is essentially tracking all of the logging approvals and all of the road building into Fairy Creek and surrounding old growth forests. The original blockade was right up here, and I'm about to go over to planet.com and look at what satellite imagery is today. And then I communicate that to the on-the-ground activists, and then the on-the-ground activists can basically show up and blockade a location, as soon as the next morning.
That's exactly what Joshua did back in July.
I saw road building approvals that would basically go into the headwaters of the Fairy Creek rainforest. That would basically have logged the headwaters of that entire area, logged some of the best old growth yellow cedar forests around, got in contact with Carol Tootle, and Carol Tootle sent an email out to a group of activists, and in the next few days, they set up a blockade there and stopped the road building just on the crest of the ridge to Fairy Creek.
Joshua recently spotted another move by the logging company.
Teal Jones had just put in an application to do road building on Edinburgh Mountain south of Eden Grove. So I talked to the on-the-ground activists, and we both thought it was a good idea to set up a blockade while it was still pending approval. And sure enough, the road did get approved, and the very next morning, crews from Stone Pacific Contractor came to the blockade near Eden Grove and tried to get through it to log that forest. And as it happens, we were there first, and we turned them away. And because of that, this area of Valley Bottom old growth forest is still around.
Pablo, who prefers to use his first name only, is part of that quick response team. They now have a camp near Eden Grove.
Right now that we've built these, we call them satellite blockades. So we've got a few buses and we've got a few campers that are set up and stocked and ready to go. Our eyes in the sky tell us that there's logging happening somewhere in an essential area. We're ready to just jump in the bus at a moment's notice, roll out, and set up.
Priya is a recent arrival.
You're putting your body into the defense of something.
It shows a lot. It shows, that this is important. We need to be here now.
Have you had any difficult encounters with folks from the timber industry who would rather you just pack up and leave? You're nodding, Donna.
Yeah, of course, some of them are not really happy of us being here. We also had some longer understanding why we are here, and knowing that it's something special. Those old growths it's not a big trees only, it's all an ecosystem that is really important.
There's also been times when they're surprisingly understanding. They're like, I don't disagree with what you're doing. That's what a logger has told us. And they turn around and like, okay, next time I'll bring the donuts.
Jessica Gallender arrived last month from British Columbia's Lower Mainland. She's thought a lot about why she's become a forest defender.
Just looking to get connected to like-minded folks doing direct action up here.
A lot of people wonder why people like you and me do direct action.
Right.
What do you say to them?
I feel like we're at such a critical point that small gestures are ineffective, and more drastic means of applying pressure to government and industry are necessary, and just talking isn't going to work.
Taking a stand counts.
Yeah.
For Emily from Saskatoon, Fairy Creek has become a passion.
What makes you say that?
The passion part? I guess just being in the forest, actually experiencing it firsthand, makes a big difference. And once I got here, it's a very magical place to be.
Emily has been at Fairy Creek for about 2 months.
Do you think you'll be around a bit longer?
Indefinitely. I'll be here for this foreseeable future. As long as it takes, pretty much. So.
As long as it takes for what?
To stop the logging, the road building, just all of it.
As we were about to leave, a blockade supporter showed up.
Okay, vegetables. Where do you want these? You asked for green. They're all green.
Yeah, there's some tools over there.
Yeah. Okay, here you go. Who wants this? Celery. Broccoli. What these guys are doing, I 100% believe in. And some of them have been here for more than 3 months and longer. And I believe for the future, I want my children to be able to come and walk in Eden Grove like I got to yesterday. And I just think it's essential for everybody's future. So if I can help by bringing them food, that's what I'll do until whenever.
We contacted the Teal Jones Group through emails and telephone calls. We wanted to get the company's response to what's happening in Fairy Creek. Nobody from the company responded. Likewise, we requested an interview with Katrine Conroy, the Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. We were told the minister would not be available for an interview. British Columbia's NDP government announced in September that it would defer logging on 353,000 hectares of old-growth forest, which was called for by a two-person strategic old-growth review panel. The government's move came shortly before Premier John Horgan called his controversial snap election. Now, recently, we interviewed independent scientist Karen Price. She has a PhD in behavioral ecology. She is an expert on old-growth forests. Karen lives remotely in British Columbia, so her video signal is very weak. You're only going to hear Karen's voice, but what she says, we believe, is very important.
Independent scientist Karen Price says the NDP's response to the panel's review of old growth in the province was disturbing because it includes what's essentially a lie. Price, along with another scientist and a forester, had conducted their own months-long study of BC's old growth, which included extensive examinations of the government's own documents, and had turned their research over to the panel. First among the government panel's key findings was this unequivocal statement: the priorities that currently drive our forest management system are backwards. Rather than determine what must be done to maintain ecosystem health and resilience, and then what social and economic benefits we can derive within that guidance, we often do the opposite.
While we would grade the strategic review an A, we figured that the initial response at that time in September from the government really deserved a D. It was missing a lot of the key elements. It was abysmal. So if we see this as a starting point rather than an end point, then it doesn't get a fail, it gets a D.
But you just called it abysmal, didn't you?
I did.
Why?
What was worrying about it was that it really missed the most important of the recommendations of the old growth panel when it comes to changing the way that we manage forest, was to declare the conservation of ecosystem health and biodiversity of BC's forests as an overarching priority. If we did that, that would really be paradigm shifting. It would be new and holistic. Now, while the government claimed that their change was going to be paradigm shifting, new and holistic, they missed that piece. And without that piece, we're not going to see any change because this is foundational. So this is really what we need to move forest management beyond simple rules that place minimizing impact to timber supply at the apex.
Basically giving industry what it wants, which is to, as you just noted, minimize the possibility of shortages of the timber supply.
Yes, so our current policy in the forest practices and planning regulation states that we will try to maintain biodiversity, providing that it does not unduly impact BC's timber supply. So in terms of setting aside old forest, you're only allowed to set aside a maximum of 4% impact to timber supply. In setting aside areas for wildlife habitat, you're only allowed to impact timber supply by 1%. So timber clearly has a veto over these other values.
That's a fairly discouraging thing, I think, for our viewers to hear at a time when the climate crisis is on everybody's mind, if they're conscious at all, and the importance of nature-based solutions can't be overstated. So would you talk to me about that?
Yes, I could. So we're in the middle of a climate crisis as well as a biodiversity crisis. Protection of old growth forest has the potential to help with both of these crises. So if we want to think about carbon, old forests, particularly highly productive old forests, have been amassing carbon for centuries and millennia. In some cases, we have forests that have been undisturbed since glaciation. Essentially, it's a carbon storage facility. And the best thing we can do right now for mitigating climate change in terms of forest management has nothing to do with planting trees. Because planting trees, new trees, don't build carbon for at least the first 30 years. And that's way too late to do anything. The best thing we can do is to keep productive, wet old forests where they stand. Leave them upright. They're storing carbon. If we leave this old growth standing, there's a lesser chance of floods. As I mentioned, they resist wildfires. So for a number of reasons, both mitigation and climate adaptation, we should be leaving these forests standing in place.
I'd like to talk now about what you and your colleagues call the heart of the government's response. And that's, of course, to the Old Growth Strategic Review. What is the heart of it? What really got you when you started looking at the numbers they were putting out?
So the heart of the report was a claim that they were deferring harvest on 353,000 hectares of BC's old growth. And so we went, okay, well, deferring, that's not protecting, but I can understand. That makes sense. We need to have land use planning. Once we managed to actually find outlines of these areas, we decided to analyze what type of forest was in there. And we found that of this 350,000 plus hectares of quotations here, old forest, a quarter of it wasn't classified as forested. So if it has trees, they're stunted at best.
What about the other 3/4 of that 350,000 hectare area?
There's another quarter that is forested, but it's not old. So it includes new clear cuts. So again, half of this area in total is not old forest, as the government claimed it was.
All right, so that leaves us with the last half. What's that?
If we look at the last half, most of this area is low productivity forest. So when we actually look at the area of productive forest that most people think about when they think of old growth, big trees, the kind that the old growth strategic panel said was at high risk of biodiversity loss and should be protected immediately. Out of our 353,000 hectares of, in quotes, old forest deferral, there's only 3,800 hectares of productive old forest of the type identified as needing immediate action by the panel that's not already in a no harvest zone. So we're talking about 1%.
Wow. Now listen, I've been at this game of reporting on environmental issues for a long time. This sounds like a lot of smoke and mirrors to me on the government part. What's your reaction to that?
I wish that I could trust them. I want to say that I think that the forest minister tried to do what he could, but with policy that puts timber first, it was too difficult, especially coming up to an election, to do anything more than grab some pieces that were already in process and put those in as a statement that, yes, we are responding to the old growth panel. The part that's a little bit more concerning to me is that now we're into a full NDP government now, and Premier Horgan committed to implement all of the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Panel. And if we look at Minister Conroy's mandate letter, it does indeed include direction to, quoting here, implement the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review in collaboration with Indigenous leaders, labor, industry, and environmental groups to protect more old growth stands, in addition to the 353,000 hectares protected in September 2020. I find this a disturbing statement because it includes what's essentially a lie, and what government now knows is a lie. The 353,000 hectares, A, isn't actually protected. It's deferred harvest for 2 years. B, it's not actually old forest, and they now know this because they've been provided with the analysis. So I find it troubling that they're claiming that this is something they've done. And then the part that troubles me even more is the way the sentence is worded. It's implementing the recommendations ... to protect more old growth stands. That's not the biggest piece within the strategic panel review. The piece that needs to be in there is to shift our paradigm from one of timber first to one where we put ecosystem health and biodiversity as a priority. And that's not anywhere in here. The other thing is that we've known about this for more than 4 decades. We've known that we were going to run out of old growth. We've known that the policy is to cut everything that's not protected. And now we're essentially running right at the cliff. The cliff is at our feet, and we're continuing with the same policy.
It's interesting that you talk about this ongoing for 4 decades, this inability to come to terms with the reality of an environmental limit. That's essentially what you're saying. Because this also parallels in time frame the same kind of pushing aside the pressures that we all knew we were facing because of the climate crisis. And that's another cliff, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes, and personally I feel we've already jumped off that one.
Why is that, Karen?
I have very little hope that anything aside from revolution is going to change our policies quickly enough that we're able to reduce our climate impact to a level where the impacts are non-catastrophic.
As we noted earlier, our request for an interview with Minister Conroy was turned down. We also requested an interview with Premier John Horgan and never received an answer. But we at XRTV believe the public record speaks loudly and clearly. Perhaps that's why they don't want to speak at all. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.